the end of this particular series on the esoteric tradition. It is only just and right and our bounden duty that we should pay due attention to the greatest enlightening influx that at least our culture received regarding the esoteric tradition, which was in the 19th century, and the principal agent of which was Madame Blavatsky. And we are, as you know, in the building of the Theosophical Society, of one of its local lodges. I have been a faithful member of the Theosophical Society since 1952, and which also means that I was alive all that time, so that's quite useful. I traveled not all the world, but let's say Europe, North America, Australia and New Zealand under the auspices of the Theosophical Society lecturing, and I met obviously not all the great lights because they had gone out by that time, but quite a few of the great lights of Theosophy throughout that period, and I was always very grateful for that. So it is obvious that we should address ourselves to this particular manifestation, major manifestation, and probably the greatest manifestation, at least in our lifetimes, of the esoteric tradition. And I'm reminded of dear Mr. Manly Hall's a statement which is found in one of his sort of coffee table book-sized books, early ones, nice ones. It is called The Phoenix. And in The Phoenix there is an article by Mr. Hall about Madame Blavatsky and her picture, and he concludes the article by saying that take away the contribution of Madame Blavatsky and all of modern occultism falls like a card of stars. Like like a pack of cards. And that he was quite right. Mr. Hall was very fond of Madame Blavatsky, so much so that along with a number of other people whom he thought highly of, he himself, with his own hands, built a bronze bust about this tall of Madame Blavatsky, which was in his office and later on in the library for a long time. You know, he had no training in sculpture at all, but that doesn't mean that he didn't know how to do it. And so it was all before my time when these were sculpted. But he sculpted a number of busts like this. One was Madame Blavatsky, one was Mahatma Gandhi.
That's still in the library.
That's still there.
I don't see Madame Blavatsky there, but Gandhi's bust.
Yeah, and there was also a nice painting of Madame Blavatsky in the upper lecture room. In any event, I think, so he thought very highly of Blavatsky, and I certainly agree with him, and so I thought that maybe it would be nice to kind of sweep up what we have of the esoteric tradition and relate it to one of its greatest prophets, at least in our days, to Madame Blavatsky and to those who followed her. Now, with that we can address ourselves perhaps to the subject itself, and let's see, first of all, we need to consider very briefly the time frame within which Madame Blavatsky and her great associate, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, and then the subsequent great disciples like Annie Besant and G.R.S. Mead and so operated, because we can't be so filled with our own pride in our condition that we don't recognize the fact that we are all in various ways, but still very powerfully the children of our time. And so we need to consider what kind of psychospiritual milieu, as we say it in French, environment did Blavatsky come from, and what was going on in the late 18th and the early 19th century in the world, and more particularly in Europe. I became acquainted in a very superficial manner initially when I was about 16 years old in Budapest at my school with the word Theosophy. And what attracted me to it was that there was a chapter, it was a Catholic sort of young people's school seminary, and there was an article in this particular textbook on Gnosticism, and in which somehow I was already very interested ever since my early childhood, and so I looked at it right away. And then way down on the bottom of the article there was a little footnote saying this, the most pernicious, I'm translating, it was not in English, this the most pernicious of all heresies has happily vanished, but some of it goes on in the strange teachings of Theosophy. And I said, aha, this indicates that maybe there is something around now where I could find out more about this subject, and indeed I did. As I intended to tell you in the course of the little talk, that the word Theosophy, Theosophia, the divine wisdom, incidentally originates with one of the esoteric schools of the Alexandrian period, or whatever else we want to call it, within the first 3 or 4 or 5 centuries, namely the Neoplatonic movement. That was the time when the mysteries of old, the Greeks of the Romans, had sort of declined. There was still some of the Eleusinian mysteries going on, but on the whole, by that time, this was already the post-Christian era, so there was not so much of that. And you might say that the intentions, the message, and the methods of the mysteries, whether they be the mysteries of Eleusis, the mysteries of Dionysus, and various other mysteries, the Egyptian mysteries, whether they were to have still some impact on the culture, they were put forth in a more public manner without all the secrecy and the initiation, say, of the Eleusinian mysteries, and thereby at least the spirit of the mysteries, the teachings of the mysteries, and to some extent the experiences of the mysteries were carried forward by what I like to call the three-leaved clover Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism. Now we have talked about the other two, let's see, Neoplatonism in turn was a school that professed and accomplished teaching the mystical core of the message of the great philosopher Plato. The Neoplatonists were convinced, and I think with good reason, that at the foundation of Platonic philosophy there was mystical experience, and that Plato was more than a philosopher. Plato was an illumined wise man, and there are people who advocate that view even today, and I think with good reason. Now, the principal teacher of the Neoplatonic school was a man named Ammonius Saccus, and Saccus meaning the one with the bag. And he was a totally self-taught mystic who worked in the daytime in the dockyards of Alexandria, unloading the cargo, because that was a big port for transporting of various goods. And then when he was done with his daily labors, then he went to the city, one of the city parks, and there he started teaching. And there he would teach the Platonic, the mystical core of Plato's philosophy to the people. He had a number of disciples, Plotinus, Iambricus, and a couple of others, and really the Neoplatonic tradition, according to some of the scholars, was really also one of the main carriers of the esoteric tradition into the subsequent historical period. In any event, he coined the term Theosophy, the wisdom of the gods, that there is the wisdom of humans that pertains to human affairs, but that if you really work at it and you extend your consciousness into the deeper realms of understanding and knowing, then you would attain not just to the Sophia, the wisdom of the philosophers, but the divine wisdom. And so, and particularly owing to the fact that this was not a Christian school, when the Christians began to take over, they didn't bother the Neoplatonists, they didn't bother the Hermeticists either, because they didn't call themselves Christians. The ones whom they bothered were my friends the Gnostics, because they incorporated the esoteric teachings of Jesus and considered themselves, esoteric Christians, if you want to use a current term. But this could not be applied to Neoplatonism, and so the Neoplatonists were quite famous, and their meetings were well attended, their scriptures were well read. So it is probably because of the universal nature of the esoteric teachings of Plato, because of the fact that Platonism was not tied to any one religion, Christian or otherwise, that the Alexandrian masters, read by all of these people, chose the term Neoplatonism for their teachings, and felt that they were able to communicate, and more than that, they were able to induce in their audiences, and their audiences were big. You read some of the old accounts of Alexandria, and say especially when Ammonius got off the ship and walked on land and then got to the park where he was going to preach, well, the people came from everywhere. So there were thousands of people in Alexandria listening to Ammonius, the sack bearer, Saccus, because he bore the luggage that was taken, the goods that were taken off the ships. So there's also kind of an interesting sideline that he was someone who worked with his hands, like a laborer in the stockyard, but who was probably one of the greatest philosophers of that period. Now, I don't know, I think there are some indications in the literature of the 19th century that some of the people who gathered in New York City in 1875, a small group, but a group of eminent students and scholars, that they were very fond of the figure and the teachings of Ammonius Saccus, and therefore they felt to call their new organization the Theosophical Society. Now, what else can we say? The early Theosophical Society had two, and actually clear until the turn of the century, because Blavatsky died a few years before the century turned from the 19th to the 20th, and Colonel Olcott died in about 1906. So they were the first theosophists, let us say. Now, that being the case, we may need to address ourselves, at least briefly, as to why they formed that little organization and what they were really up to. That's not so easy to find out, because neither of them were very talkative people who would just, talk about their ideas without any solid reason, and therefore it became more and more public that what they were really after was the ancient esoteric tradition, that they became aware that Ammonius, the Porter philosopher, was a representative of an enduring tradition of esotericism, which is in many ways at the heart, at the inmost core of a number of what could be called exoteric philosophies or exoteric religions, and which, however, always has these statements of the esoteric tradition having a good deal to do with each other as they were put forth. So that whether we were dealing with Neoplatonism, we were dealing with some of the Gnostics, we were dealing with various schools of this sort. They really deserved the names of representatives of the esoteric tradition, because their central message was a mystical one. Now, what do I mean in this context by mystical? That all of these philosophical schools, and we can certainly include some others, all of these philosophical schools were really centered on the transcendental potential of the soul and mind of the individual. Therefore, not mainly an intellectual approach, whether it whether it would be Aristotle or whether it would be Plato or another one, which of course had a great deal of philosophical, intellectual material, but that ultimately goes back to the central core of the human soul, where they all felt there existed a living connection with the transcendental realities, and that therefore if one addressed oneself to those, then one was on the path to a greater consciousness and a more generally available deific consciousness. So that really what they were up to was not merely information, but if we don't mind that play on words, not information but transformation. In other words, something that would really transform and elevate to another, a higher and different consciousness the individual who studied this particular philosophical approach. And that was certainly true of Ammonius Saccus, it was true of Plotinus, it was true of Iambricus, it was true of all of these people. So we can see how this was a continuation of the mysteries. Because what were the mysteries about? You know, they were not sort of, Sherlock Holmes type mysteries to find out whether the dog barked in the night or not, but they were the mysteries in the sense that of the strange and probably earlier unknown and unheard realities of the soul, and through which the individual consciousness can journey and there be not only informed but actually changed and transformed into its higher likeness. So it is certainly not without a good reason and a good background that this group of esoteric scholars, and most of them were scholars, people who had written books, people who were studying Neoplatonism and Hermeticism and things of that sort, particularly of the Western tradition at that time. The Eastern came later, so that these people were obviously interested in a philosophy, meaning a love of wisdom that in turn would make you into an inspired, a transformed, wise person. And so it was a good name, it was a good title. And these people were sort of gathered together by a very interesting man who was a Yankee of as much as that anyone can be a Yankee from Connecticut, by the name of Henry Steele Olcott. And the Olcott family is still well known in that area. We've been to Hartford, Connecticut, and it was pointed out to us that there is a major street to this day in Hartford that is named Olcott Street. But of course, he was one of the members of that family, all kinds of prominent activities that they were engaged in. So Henry Steele Olcott was a very many-sided and interesting man. He was, for one thing, his civilian occupation was that he was an agricultural expert. And he was studying the ways in which agriculture in the United States can be improved and how various agricultural products, plants and so forth that were not available could be cultivated here. And I don't hesitate to tell you, even if you should be scandalized, that one of his main attentions in terms of agricultural product was to the tobacco plant. And that Connecticut to this day is one of the main tobacco producers of the United States. So we grow the tobacco in Connecticut, we take it down to Florida where the Cubans are, and the Nicaraguans and all the rest, and they then make, they make delicious cigars out of them, and my mouth is watering. So that was definitely one of their, and then in addition to that, people were very many-sided in those days. And so his additional field of interest and study, in addition to agriculture, was also the human mind, the human spirit, the human soul. And it's more along those lines then that his further interests developed. But let us say, then came the Civil War, which of course was a major conflagration in the history of the country, and in many ways I think we still haven't gotten over it. I have traveled the South. I lived for a number of days in the town of Corinth, Mississippi, and let me tell you, I had more fun in Corinth, Mississippi than I had in Chicago or in New York, And man, oh man, the fried chicken, absolutely unsurpassed. In any event, so the war broke out, and Henry Olcott was recruited by none other but by President Abraham Lincoln himself to join the armed services, and was given the title of colonel. And when you read about him in the various books, he's usually referred to as Colonel Olcott. And of course, he was a man of many talents. So now, when the Civil War was over, and he, being a lawyer, he was also qualified in law. Being a lawyer, he was able to help President Lincoln in prosecuting the crookedness that went on, particularly in the Navy. I don't know why the Navy should be more crooked than other troops, but in any event, the corruption which was going on in the armed services, because, the armed services always, they could order anything that they wanted, and then they sold half of it, and the generals and the colonels kept it, So Colonel Olcott was investigating these, and apparently quite successfully, because he was commended in the letters of commendation by President Lincoln, who considered him a very valuable asset to the armed services. But as I say, he had these other interests. Now, when the Civil War was over, or almost over, the Civil War didn't end till the 60s? 55. So close.
65.
655.
And Lincoln was killed in April of 65.
Yeah. So in any event, so Colonel Olcott became civilian, but was still always referred to as a colonel. And he was writing learned books on agriculture and all kinds of things of that sort. And something else of a different nature, but still of a culturally and spiritually very important character, arose at that time. Beginning, I think, in 1849, and I'm never good with figures. I never was. I was a very bad mathematics student. I was a very bad chemistry student. All of those doggone things where you have to deal with numbers and so forth. But in any event, about 1849, there was already an upsurge in the United States of a new, it's kind of hard to, let's say, a new quasi-religious preoccupation. Nowadays they would call it a cult, which you say that a cult is a bad word, but you know, the Latin cultus merely means worship. You know, the cult of Isis or the cult of Venus or something like that. So it's not really good to use that as a pejorative. But in any way, this particular school of thought, let us say, was and is, because it has survived, spiritualism. Now, it is not my object to go through the history of the spiritualist movement, but let us say that in the very early part of the 19th century and the latter part of the 18th century, certain discoveries were made, largely by the medical profession, of what nowadays we call altered consciousness. Now, don't think that they had their own LSD or that they were picking the mushrooms in the Black Forest. And then I picked mushrooms in the Black Forest, but I went with them. We went with them. We have big baskets of mushrooms. We went with them to a German lady there who apparently was the mushroom lady in the town of Calf. And that's the Rosicrucian town, you know. And we said, well, dear Frau so-and-so, we know that among these mushrooms there are some that are poisonous, and we are not anxious to ingest those. Could you be so kind to pick out the ones that are good from the ones that are bad? Oh, sure. Go on your way and go into the forest and look for more mushrooms, and meanwhile I'll take care of this. So as that usually happens, about half of our mushroom crop went into the garbage because it was poisonous. That's why you have to be careful with mushrooms. But why that they came up, well, anyway, psychedelic mushrooms. But so this was a time when not with the mushrooms or any other psychedelic known to us, but sort of as the result of their own explorations with various things, a lot of people became very fond of altered states of consciousness. And these altered states were primarily propagated and taught by a doctor, medical doctor, Austrian medical doctor from the state of Vorarlberg, I think. It's a beautiful part of Austria, the great big, the Lake of Constance. Anyway, that's where he came from. His name was Dr. Franz Anton Messmer, and he had come up with what came to be called accurately mesmerism. Well, in any way, he felt that he developed various techniques in putting people into an altered state of consciousness, which were probably mostly of a hypnotic nature. The name hypnosis hadn't been invented yet. And so the people who were mesmerized went into a kind of twilight state and things like that. They would have unusual experiences and unusual statements that they made to those who were with them, the doctors and others. Now, That being the case, the situation developed further, and the Mesmer's practices and Mesmer's teachings became quite well known and quite controversial. And out of that interest, there grew another one. You know the way these things work. There grew another interest, and that interest was communicating with possibly some beings, some entities in the other world, whether they may be the souls of the dead or in some other ways, angels, unusual beings, communicating with them by way of this mesmeric trance. Because an altered state of consciousness, as probably most of us know by now after the 60s and so forth, an altered state of consciousness will put you in touch with experiences that otherwise would not be available to you. And so when that came about, that in turn led to what came to be called spiritualism. Or in France it was called Spiritism. And it's still called that in Brazil, which picked up the French spiritualist tradition. And all that can really be said about it, that owing to these various practices, some people would become what were called and are still called mediums. And it's a medium being somebody who is able to be in between the world of the spirits and the humans. Mediator between the two of them. Now then, this being the case, this sort of opened up some doors to all sorts of things, and among them probably the main one was that people became aware of the possibility of extraordinary states of consciousness, including the communicating or alleged communicating with spirits. Now, as soon as this of course again opened up a whole big field of interest, because people were really interested in communicating with the spirits. And why do you think so? Because so many of their own family members, their fathers, their brothers, their cousins have been killed in the Civil War. Millions of them. I mean, you know, that was a very, very bloody engagement. The more I read that there was a greater number of casualties in the Civil War than in any war that the United States ever fought. That is, the Indian War, the Mexican War, and the whole First World War, Second World War, the campaign in Asia, none of them killed off as many as American men than did the Civil War. Now then, once you know and I know that once you have people who were close to you and whom you miss greatly when they die, then you welcome any kind of purported avenue whereby you might be able to communicate with them. And so the people would trudge over to the medium's house, which was usually an ordinary farmhouse somewhere where the owner lady of the farm had developed mediumistic capacities, or so she thought. And then they sat down and had what came to be called a séance. And a séance is just French for sitting. So people came down, they sat down around the table, and the medium would go into some altered states of consciousness and bring messages from the beyond and various things of that sort. So I'm sure that in the in the early 19th century, the late 18th century, activities of this sort were of interest. There were no movies yet, there was no television yet. In the cities, in the big cities, there was some theater, but that was about it. So if you wanted entertainment, you trudged down to the friendly neighborhood medium, maybe on certain evenings of the week, and then you sat down by the table, because usually these seances would start with table tapping. The people all sat around the table and they put their hands together, and then the table would started shifting and moving and sometimes rising in the air. There are bona fide reports, for instance, that Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of President Abraham Lincoln, was very interested in spiritualism, and that by way of some mediums whom she contacted, and she was apparently mediumistic herself, they managed to lift a full grand piano in the White House up into the air, so it was floating in the air. Well, I wasn't there, and I never met anybody who was there, but it's a heck of a good story. In any event, all this sort of thing was going on. So the interest in the mystery of life, in the mystery of consciousness of the soul, had increased, and apparently the terrible Civil War had given it a real boost. Now I need to mention that because this means that the interest in these things, and primarily in spirits, in ordinarily invisible entities and forces, was very prevalent in the United States as well as in other countries. It wasn't just a small group of people on Beechwood Drive sitting talking about spirits like no, but there are a lot of people all over the place, from the millionaires' mansions in New York, in Chicago, down to also to other people. The spiritists, the spiritualists were everywhere, and the interest in these matters grew and grew. Now what we need to keep in mind, and that's really true of religious and spiritual matters generally, that when some people are able to produce or somehow facilitate some phenomena of an unusual nature, that their explanation, their legendary that they present with the phenomenon is not always taken literally. And so when they said, well, we put you in touch with the spirits of the dead, a lot of the people who went there said, why, no, I don't have anybody dead by that name, or whatever the case. They shied away from the necro aspect of the situation, but at the same time they felt and knew that there was something there. Now, in the days of my misspent youth, I went to a few seances because I'm interested in these things here in Los Angeles, and I wanted to find out what they were about. Well, some things were happening. What they were really in detail, I couldn't know, but very often there would be a mediumistic person there, and then they would manifest, often in a voice different of their own, they would manifest messages from the invisible. Who it was in this, sometimes they would identify themselves particularly as one of the dear departed, as the kind of the Victorian term for the dead was. They probably fought with that person when he was alive, but now he became the dear departed. Well, at least, already the Romans had a saying, "De mortuis nil nisi bene," of the dead, say nothing bad. That, in other words, you should not invoke the ire of the dead by saying bad things about them. And I think that's a good idea, because whether for the living or the dead to insult people, especially people who cannot talk back to you, is, I don't think, a very honorable procedure. So in any event, there they were, the spiritualists, but again, I don't think that they were just only Aunt Fanny and Uncle Joe who were looking for somebody on the other side, because some of the people who came were to these seances and studied them were pretty famous people. And this went on all through the 19th century and into the 20th century. Famous writers, famous poets, famous artists, painters and so forth, they were all interested in spiritualism, because it opened up sort of another level of consciousness to them. And as such, I can well see that the interest would have been present. Now, all of this I have to throw at you as an introduction to Madame Blavatsky, because it was not exactly that she never got along with the spiritualists too well, but it wasn't exactly spiritualism, but the interest in what now we call the paranormal, the unusual, that which is not ordinarily experienced, which was ubiquitous everywhere, that drew people like Madame Blavatsky in this particular time in the 1870s to America and to New York. And it's amazing to me when they have been collected in historical books, when I read about the articles and extracts of from journals and so forth, as to how interested people were in this spooky stuff. I mean, big articles. Famous spiritualist scholar is from Russia, is coming to New York. Her name is Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, and she will receive people who want to come and see her on Tuesday mornings at such and such an apartment in is it East Manhattan or West Manhattan? I don't know New York that well, and things like that. And people were really interested. Now you have to publish a paper saying that a candidate for the presidency has been shot in the ear. Really, when they want a bloody truth, it really is bloody. And that time it was different. In any event, there was this unusual lady, and fairly soon she got around primarily to these spiritualists and people who were researching these sorts of things. And then I don't know how long she has been here, but only maybe a year or two, when she went to a particular seance situation in the state of New York, because that's where spiritualism really started, was in Hydesville, New York. It's such a doggone little burg that you can't even find it on the map. But because there was some poltergeist manifestations. The spirits were knocking and then people came. And this was on other town, the name of which is also in the state of New York. So Madame Blavatsky said, well, things are kind of boring in New York City. I'll go down and see what the heck goes on out in the countryside. So she went to that's no longer Hydesville, but I have never been to any of them myself. It's not my thing to go around and visit small farm communities in New York State. But in any event, let's see, where they are. In any event, this, by the way, is the book that I'm really very fond of at the present time and that I can recommend to everyone, called Modern Occultism by Mitch Horowitz. And Mr. Horowitz is a wonderful historian, and one can not only be entertained and interested, but you can also trust his veracity when he writes. So in any event, here he describes Blavatsky's and her activities at that time. In the winter 1877, so this would have been already in 75, two years after the founding of the little Theosophical Society in Manhattan, 1877, there stood a squat red brick tenement on the west side of Manhattan at 8th Avenue and 47th Street. Not being a New Yorker, none of that means much to me. What is today considered Hell's Kitchen, well, that's almost sort of appropriate, or the theater district. The 5-story brick building still stands as an Econo Lodge, part of the discount hotel chain. But in winter of the early 1877, it was a walk-up dwelling. On the second floor sat a cramped warren of rooms, which the New York press jokingly dubbed the Lamassery, for the religious monasteries of Tibet. Within the Lamassery dwelt Madame H.P. Blavatsky, a world-traveled Russian noblewoman who arrived in New York City in 1873. So she's been there already for 4 years at that time. 1873. She came, she explained, because she yearned to visit the birthplace of spiritualism. More so, she felt that the free religious winds in the U.S. made the nation a propitious launchpad for the reignition of occult spirituality. And that is true, because we probably don't often think of that when it comes to even into the 19th century, the kind of religious freedom that people enjoyed in the United States was found practically nowhere on the face of the earth. So, we should sometimes be grateful to those dear gentlemen in their beautiful silk pants and their powdered wigs who sat together in Philadelphia and who framed the Constitution and other the Declaration of Independence, because they tried something that nobody else tried. And so it's very, very unusual. So that being the case, on heterodox movements, little churches with us a kind of prophetess, usually female, reading it, and spiritualists and Rosicrucians and people like that would come over from Europe, and generally they, like they were attracted by magnets, they all went to the Hudson Valley in the state of New York. It's an interesting place. I've been there. In fact, I had a venue to lecture there, and I lectured there for 30 years once a year. I went to the Hudson Valley, and I still have friends there. So in any event, it's an interesting neck of the woods. And so all kinds of strange people got together there. The early Mormons even, they don't like to tell you that. They like to talk about Salt Lake City or Missouri, but not about New York State, because I think that they probably threw their prophet Smith out. The people people in New York State are tough people. If they don't like somebody, they throw them out. If they hate him even more, then they tar them and feather them. So there could have been something like that. In any event, all right. On the second floor of that building sat a cramped warren of rooms. Oh, I already read that. All right. So, about a year after arriving, Madame Blavatsky met her roommate, subsequent roommate. I'm going to have to tell Mitch that that's not a good term to use. But in any event, her roommate, Henry Steele Olcott, a retired staff colonel from the Civil War. During Henry's 20s, he was considered a wunderkind of scientific agriculture. As an officer, he was among the first investigators of the Lincoln assassination, even that. So maybe he was sort of the American Sherlock Holmes as well. Henry later grew interested in spiritualism and researched various mediumistic claims. His efforts led to an 1875 book, People from the Other World, an illustrated investigation. Incidentally, that is also the year when he, in concert with Madame Blavatsky and a bunch of other intellectual weirdos, founded the Theosophical Society in November, I think November 17th, 1875. In any event, so the two, Blavatsky and Olcott, met on a porch in Chittenden, Vermont. Oh, it was in Vermont, not in New York. In 1874, Henry was on assignment for one of the New York dailies to investigate a ghost farm run by two brothers, William and Horatio Eddy. Oh yes, the famous Eddy brothers. The siblings claimed they were able to conjure ghostly phenomena and otherworldly spirits. Well, there you are. So they became friendly, and Olcott, people, particularly literate people like that in those days, always kept a diary, which I wish that some of us would, because I never kept a diary, and I wrote some memoirs which would need revising. Therefore, if you keep a diary and write about me, that'll be my way to get into the public reading, public's mind. But I don't really feel that it's going to happen. So, in any way, there they were. One and they called it the Lamassery because Blavatsky spoke a good deal about Tibet and about Tibetan Buddhism, and she had various Buddhist artifacts and things like that with her. So one winter night at the Lamassery in 1877, Henry, he just refers to him as Henry. I'm going to ask Mr. Mitch Horowitz, do you refer to people whom you never met by their first name? But I guess that's a custom also. So he experienced perhaps the formative episode of his life. Madame Blavatsky had gone to sleep, and he was seated alone in his room, reading by the flicker of a gas lamp. Henry was poring over explorer John Lloyd Stephens' memoir of scouting Mayan ruins in Yucatan, with the only noises the hiss of steam heat. Reading and smoking, Henry was suddenly startled to attention. There appeared before him, with no footsteps, creaking footboards, or sound of an opening door, a massively tall, turbaned man, later identified as Master Moria, an adept from the East. All at once, Henry Olcott wrote in the memoir Old Diary Leaves, of which we have, or at least we used to have all the volumes in our library back there, but I'm sure they weren't all stolen yet, so we probably have some others. Actually, the old gentleman was a pretty good writer. He writes in a very lively manner. So anyway, there we are. Henry was suddenly startled to attention. There appeared before him, with no footsteps, creaking floorboards, or sound of an opening door, a massively tall, turbaned man, later identified as Master Moria, an adept from the East. All at once, again, Henry wrote in his memoir, Old Diary Leaves, as I read with my shoulder a little turned to the door, there came a gleam of something white in the right-hand corner of my eye. I turned my head, dropped my book in astonishment, and saw towering above me in his great stature an Oriental clad in white garments and wearing a headcloth or turban of amber-striped fabric, hand-embroidered in yellow floss silk. It was one of the hidden masters that Madame Blavatsky said had been tutoring her since adolescence, and from whom Henry had begun receiving letters during his efforts with the Miracle Club. That was the predecessor of the Theosophical Society. Now standing before Henry in resplendent white garb, with a silk turban encircling his head, was this Eastern mystery teacher Moria, who Henry later recounted, reassured the acolyte that he was on the right path. So in other words, Colonel, don't run away. Just stay here. I'll tell you something important. Yeah. So now then, this of course brings up various issues, but the reason I read this to you is because there are several accounts of Colonel Olcott, and of course of other people, of having seen these so-called masters. The very first experience of Colonel Henry Steele Olcott with one was this one. And so when you read a lot of his, like his diaries or so, he usually doesn't mention this one. But Mr. Horowitz dug it up somewhere, and so it's an unusual statement. Now then, I think we need to take a little jump backwards and say, you know, what is this business of a master called Moria? Incidentally, is a legitimate Sanskrit word and name, and the Maurya dynasty was the dynasty of Indian kings, of Maharajas, of let's see, what part of India did they come from? In any event, by this apparition or person being called Maurya, he introduces himself really as a part of Indian history. One of the greatest kings of India was Chandragupta Maurya in the Middle Ages, who sort of would be remembered like, oh, I don't know, like Napoleon in France. So it's not an unknown name. But let's say this foreshadowed a development within the Theosophical fold, which went on for a long time, and which some of us were interested in, and some of us were maybe somewhat critical of. You can guess that I belonged into the critical fold, because let's say well, I might as well tell it all if I can. The mythos of the ordinarily invisible masters, as they were called, which would manifest at various times, usually when Madame Blavatsky was present, I think did not do the Theosophical movement and the Theosophical philosophy a great deal of good. I am not denying that something was not happening, because other members of the society and various people had also encounters of a different kind with these alleged by the way, master, don't get afraid, like one of my teachers who was Australian British was one to say, he didn't like the term master either. He said, masters need slaves. And because the master and the slave, but of course that's a little bit an excessive statement. But I would say what we need to remember is that at the time we are talking about, the British school system, which was certainly established in India as well, would call its teachers master, schoolmaster, master. So it's not a slave master, although maybe sometimes they treated the pupils like slaves, but it simply means a teacher. Now that puts it in a little better light. And let's say as time went on, and I'll mention to you some of the others, the controversy about these alleged unusual people who Blavatsky apparently regarded as her occult teachers, went further and further, and more and more controversies arose, and so forth. Let's say that while Blavatsky held and stated on numerous occasions, but not really proclaimed it from the housetops, but in more private gatherings, that yes, she had been in touch with a number of teachers, spiritual teachers, who for the most part lived in the Far East, in India or in Tibet, and that her own occult powers and her teachings, which she was putting forth, were of that order. But she didn't reveal a great deal more about them. So let's say I am a suspicious character. Maybe some people would call me suspicious, but I'm a suspicious character, and I always felt that the way this master business was put forth in the theosophical circles and some others that learned from the theosophists, such as the redoubtable but also somewhat disreputable Alice Bailey and some other writers, all with masters, that even if there was something real there, that these writers and teachers corrupted it and changed it into something else. And I still think that that is true. However, that doesn't mean that something isn't true. And, well, I know it's becoming late, but I have to communicate it short anyway as to what brought my attention to a particular possibility within this field of the masters. As probably many of you know, the great psychologist, and I think we can call him the mystical psychologist, Carl Jung, wrote, but he dictated it mostly to his then secretary, Aniela Jaffe. Prior to his death, he was already thinking slowly. A book called Memory, which was published as Memories, Dreams and Reflections. It's the best autobiographical book on Jung because it comes from him. Now then, that being the case, in one particular, and of course I read that book along with many others by Jung, and I came across a passage where Jung said, well, he was writing, or telling the lady who was writing all of this down several times that he had a mysterious teacher, Jung. And at some point he even reveals that his name was Philemon. And then he doesn't say too much about it, but again makes him out as a very real personage who would come to him from time to time and help him with his ideas and with his work. And then Jung concludes that particular paragraph by saying that then Jung met a gentleman from India who was in Geneva. In Geneva they always have these things like United Nations, like disunited nations, and all kinds of foreign diplomats getting together. And this was a diplomat from India. And so they were talking, Jung and he were talking, and so the Indian said to Jung, most of us have a living guru, teacher, accomplished yogi, something like that. But he says, I am a little different because I for a long time had, and I still do, I have a guru who is no longer alive. And that is Sri Shankaracharya, very famous guru in history, the founder of the Vedanta movement. And Jung adds to it, and now I knew who and what Philemon was. Mm-hmm. And then he kept referring, and that's a bad translation, they kept referring to his statements about Philemon as my ghostly guru. Now here is the thing, I am sure that he was speaking in German, and he said, mein geistiger Guru. A geist is a ghost, but geistig means spiritual. So it's a bad translation. I hope that they corrected it, because this was published about early 50s. In any event, now maybe I'm weird, here I am a long-time member of the Theosophical Society and everything, and so many friends of mine, both among the living and the dead, who were Theosophists. But it took C.G. Jung to bring me to what I think is an understanding of what this master business is all about. And my feeling is that indeed these are like ghostly gurus. And what it means that they are not necessarily, and most of the time they are not physical entities. Why in the heck should they be physical? They can do almost anything without that, but rather that they are spirits of some sort, not the spirits of the dead, but that somewhere in the deep recesses of the human psyche there is a place where instruction about spiritual matters is available to those who come to it in the right spirit, and that this instruction is given by people like Philemon to Jung and like Moria to Blavatsky. And if we take that as a possibility, then I think the whole argument, were the masters real, weren't they real, blah, 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 goes out the window. And I need to throw in, even though it's late, in conclusion, we can bring this back again next time and throw in the reason that there was a big excitement and a sort of a scandal some years later when Blavatsky was living in India already. And what that was all about, that one of her associates, her disciples, a journalist and I think colonial officer by the name of Alan Octavian Hume, who was in India, was communicating, or so he felt, with some of these masters by letter. And he would write a letter and bring it to Blavatsky, and she said, all right, my man. And then she took it and she put it into a kind of a cabinet. She said, well, you might get an answer to that probably by tonight or by tomorrow. And they're interesting statements, very philosophical statements. Later on, even on other man who was a famous newspaper editor, his name will come to me also. There were two people who were friends of Blavatsky who were engaged in this peculiar correspondence. Now, there again, if this is a paranormal phenomenon, then I don't see anything so extraordinary with an ethereal or an astral post office coming or going. I mean, I have seen at least once something materialize that wasn't there to begin with. So those things can happen. So that's probably what happened that time. But this somebody in probably the loudmouth theosophists, of whom I am one, had raised the ruckus over this, and then a man from the Psychical Research Society, a bunch of very uppity and very filled with their own wisdom Englishmen, came out from England, and he said that Blavatsky obviously faked the letters. What was obvious about it, I don't know. You know, it took about 100 years before the Psychical Research Society had admitted that they were wrong and that was a false verdict. But in any event, a set of strange phenomena and strange circumstances surrounded Blavatsky, and what she garbed it in, what she put it in, was that much of that was due to the influence of these mysterious masters who were her teachers, and they could appear thousands of miles from there, and that they were real. Now, as I say, I think I figured out, and I just told you, a little explanation that most of you will think is probably silly, of how this really happened. And I think that it happened because they were genuine occult phenomena, but not of living people sitting in the Himalayas, but rather of people either on a spiritual level or maybe on a physical level, who had the ability to project their consciousness somewhere else and thereby be helpful to Blavatsky or anyone else. Some other time maybe I can tell you more about it. But this is sort of actually the skeleton of Blavatsky's belief that she had these teachers, they were teaching her all kinds of things. You want to know what kind of things they taught her? For instance, I got to tell you one or two because they're in the books anyway of what went on. So there they was, he was in India with all these highfalutin Anglo-Englishmen from the Viceroy's court and things like that, and they were drinking tea in the outdoors. They took a walk. Particularly Englishmen love to walk. And if I were in a place where it was raining all the time and cold, I would walk too, except that my ability to do so has been diminished at my age. But let's say, so they were drinking tea, and they were one teacup short of the number of guests who were there at this little outdoor gathering. And so Blavatsky said, I didn't count right. Come on. So she sat down, and next to him was one of her disciples. She was rubbing her hands, and putting it on. All right, over there. So their Hindu servant came and dug in the ground, and there was a teacup of the same Wedgwood make and the same pattern as all the other cups. She said, oh, well, yeah. So when I have to, I can do those things. So that's just one of the events. So she was a thaumaturg, she was a miracle worker, and she felt that her occult activities and these sorts of things were inspired and facilitated by these mysterious beings whom she sometimes referred to in very concrete human terms and sometimes others. And she continued in that fashion, and by next time, even though the title is that of looking into the future of how the esoteric tradition will proceed in the future, I will bring you some more Blavatsky, because as a university professor I know said of her, she was without any doubt the grandmother of the New Age. And what she started is still with us, and maybe the explanations about it can change here and there. In her beautiful little poem, which I read the entire poem to you the other time, which I'm not going to do there, but in the second verse This is her poem called There is a Road. I can tell you how to find those who will show you the secret gateway that opens inward only and closes fast behind the neophyte evermore. So she even there she brought in that I can introduce you to others who are better teachers than I and who are probably not even physical anymore. So there is a mystery. And I dearly wished that my brother Theosophist and sister Theosophist had recognized that earlier and not insisted on taking Blavatsky's and Olcott's words literally. Because the cosmos is full of spirits, is full of beings. And they have the ability, the power, when they wish, to appear very physical, but they are of a different species. And up to now I have seen no proof that it was different with Blavatsky. And yet this was extremely important to her. This was her ongoing inspiration, and we all should be happy that she had that contact, because by way of that contact she and Olcott and others built a very good thing, which was the Theosophical movement, and which is still with us, and which I think has done more to revive the esoteric tradition than anything and anybody since the 3rd century. So she was a messenger of heaven, and she had access to other messengers who are around us and about us, and who are even, I wouldn't be surprised, they are even in this room. Because when we strive for these things, our striving is answered, our questions are answered, and our needs are met. And when that opened up to humanity in our culture, that was a great and wonderful thing that Blavatsky and her associates did, and these graces, these happy memories, these wonderful things had never gone away. They are still here, and in their own way, you can experience them yourself. So thank you very much.